Cathay Pacific Flight 780 is in its descent, flying on just one functioning engine, when an Engine 1 stall message appears on the ECAM. Things have gone from bad to worse, as they have now lost their last functioning engine, which they relied on to reach Hong Kong. Their situation became an emergency, and the cockpit workload increased significantly. The crew declared a Mayday, advising Hong Kong approach of the double-engine stall situation. The clock is ticking, and the fate of the passengers and crew lies in the hands of the two pilots. Will they manage to land the aircraft safely? This is the story of Cathay Pacific Flight 780. It's the 13th of April, 2010, and Cathay Pacific Flight 780 is being prepared for its journey from Juanda International Airport in Indonesia to Hong Kong International Airport in China. The aircraft for this journey is an Airbus A330, fitted with two Rolls-Royce engines. Before the flight to Hong Kong, the captain performed a pre-flight inspection to ensure the aircraft was safe and ready for departure. He completed the walk-around inspection with no abnormalities identified. He noticed that the fueling dispenser operator was conducting a water check on the fuel sample. The fuel sample in the beaker was clear and bright, and the water check was clean. But unbeknownst to the captain, during the refueling, there were several occasions where vibrations in the fueling hose occurred. The dispenser operator considered the vibrations due to air trapped inside the hydrant piping, which had been disturbed by recent extension work. He stopped the refueling each time to halt the vibrations and then resumed the process afterward. However, these vibrations were a sinister warning sign of a much graver issue. The refueling trucks pump fuel from underground tanks through a filter on the truck and into the aircraft. Salt water had inadvertently entered the fuel supply and degraded the superabsorbent polymer filters, or SAP filters. These filters are designed to remove water from the fuel, but when exposed to salt water, they break down, releasing small SAP particles into the fuel system. These particles did not cause immediate visible issues and thus were not detected during routine checks. However, these little particles were ticking time bombs that would cause enormous problems during the flight. The aircraft had approximately 10,000 kilograms of fuel remaining from the previous flight, and an additional 24,400 kilograms was loaded, as planned by Cathay Pacific Airways. After verifying the fuel levels and ensuring that all safety checks were complete, the captain gave the final go-ahead for boarding, and 309 passengers boarded the aircraft. The crew consisted of 2 pilots and 11 cabin attendants. The captain, Malcolm Waters, was 35 years old and had worked for Cathay Pacific for 12 years. He had accumulated over 7,000 flying hours with 2,500 on the A330. For this flight, he was the pilot monitoring. The first officer, David, was 37 years old and had just over 4,000 flight hours, 1,000 of which were on the A330. Much of his previous flying experience was with the Australian Air Force, where he had served for 11 years. For this flight, he was the pilot flying. After all passengers had taken their seats, the Airbus was pushed back from the gate. Following a short taxi, they arrived at runway 28. The wind was variable at 2 knots with 7 kilometers of visibility. Scattered clouds were at 1,800 feet, and a few cumulonimbus clouds were at 2,000 feet. The temperature was 28 degrees Celsius. At 8:24 in the morning, The crew received clearance for takeoff, and the co-pilot moved the thrust levers forward. The Airbus began its acceleration down the runway, and 30 seconds later, the aircraft lifted off, gracefully ascending into the morning sky. Passengers settled in for their flight, enjoying the serene views as their adventure to Hong Kong began. It was a few minutes after takeoff that the pilots noticed abnormal engine pressure ratios on both engines, with engine number 2 experiencing more severe fluctuations than engine number 1. These were the first signs of trouble. EPR, or engine pressure ratio, measures the engine's efficiency by comparing the pressure of the exhaust gases to the pressure of the air entering the engine. Abnormal fluctuations in EPR indicate instability in this ratio, suggesting potential engine performance issues. Then, over half an hour after takeoff, cruising at flight level 390, the Electronic Centralized Aircraft Monitoring System, or ECAM, displayed an error message alerting the crew to a control system fault in engine 2, the right side engine. Following the initial check and troubleshooting, a second message appeared. This message indicated that engine 2 was responding slower than expected to throttle inputs. This can be caused by various issues such as fuel system problems, obstruction of the air intake system, mechanical issues, or sensor malfunctions. The crew contacted maintenance control to discuss the fluctuations. The maintenance engineer on the other end of the line asked the pilots to move the thrust levers and observe how the engines responded. They did this and noted that the engine pressure ratio was still fluctuating. However, the crew decided to continue the flight to Hong Kong because the other engine parameters were normal, not knowing that the problem would only worsen. As they started to descend to 38,000 feet, the Engine 2 control system fault warning reappeared on the ECAM, along with the Engine 2 slow response warning, and a warning advising the pilots to avoid rapid thrust changes. The pilots turned on the engine anti-ice system to see if this would fix the abnormal EPR readings, but this did not affect the fluctuation. They contacted maintenance control again and informed them that the fluctuations had increased. They asked whether it was safe to continue the flight to Hong Kong. The maintenance control engineer on the other end of the line suggested that the EPR fluctuations in Engine 1 could be caused by the flight computer attempting to adjust for the irregularities in Engine 2. He instructed the crew to monitor parameters carefully, avoid rapid thrust changes, and follow the Flight Crew Operating Manual, or FCOM procedures, if any exceedances occurred. He also mentioned that the fuel metering unit in Engine 2 would be replaced upon arrival in Hong Kong. The crew accepted his explanation and continued the flight. Another 2 hours had passed, and the problem was only getting worse without the pilots realizing it. The aircraft was now descending to Hong Kong, about 203 kilometers southeast of the international airport, when the unexpected happened. The captain heard a faint pop sound, followed by a sharp ozone and burning smell. Immediately after, the aircraft's ECAM displayed multiple errors within a short period. This indicated that Engine 1 was also malfunctioning, while the second message signified an engine compressor stall, a potentially severe engine problem. An engine compressor stall is a condition where the airflow through the compressor stage of a jet engine is disrupted, resulting in a sudden loss of compression pressure. This can lead to decreased thrust abnormal vibrations, and sometimes loud bangs or explosion-like noises. The flight crew promptly carried out the necessary ECAM actions, moving the number 2 engine's thrust lever to idle, the minimum thrust setting position. They then set the number 1 engine to maximum continuous thrust to compensate for the low thrust of the number 2 engine. However, engine number 1's N1, the speed of the engine's low-pressure compressor, a key indicator of engine power, only temporarily increased to about 57% before dropping back to about 37%. They were in big trouble. Engine number 2 was dead, while engine number 1 ran too slowly. Faced with the emergency, the crew promptly declared a pan-pan to Hong Kong air traffic control, urgently requesting to shorten their track for a priority landing. Permission was granted to proceed directly to Waypoint Limes. In response, air traffic control alerted the airport fire contingent by declaring a local standby, ensuring emergency services were on high alert. As per standard operating procedures for a one-engine inoperative scenario, the captain took control of the aircraft as the pilot flying, and the co-pilot became the pilot monitoring. The captain instructed the cabin crew to prepare the cabin for landing. He also communicated with the in-flight service manager and informed her that there was an issue with engine number 2 and that ATC had granted them a priority landing. So far, the situation was still somewhat manageable. At least, it seemed that way. But with every liter of fuel flowing into the engines, the situation worsened. And a few minutes later, about 83 kilometers southeast of Hong Kong International Airport, an Engine 1 stall message appeared on the ECAM. Things have gone from bad to worse. The monitoring system indicates they've just lost the other engine, the one they were counting on to get the aircraft to Hong Kong. Their situation quickly turned into an emergency, and the cockpit workload increased significantly. Following Airbus and company procedures for the A330, the crew declared a MAYDAY, advising Hong Kong approach of the double-engine stall situation. They were immediately cleared to descend to 3,000 feet. The captain disconnected the autopilot and the flight directors and flew the aircraft manually. ECAM actions were carried out, and the thrust for engine number 1 was reduced to the idle position. Auto thrust was disengaged, and with both engines at idle, the captain tested their controllability by adjusting the throttle for each engine one at a time. No thrust changes corresponded to the adjustments, meaning the aircraft had effectively turned into a giant glider. Sap particles, released due to the degradation of the filters when exposed to salt water, clogged the main metering valve. This valve is crucial for regulating the fuel flow to the engines. It consists of a piston that slides within a cylinder. When pilots adjust the thrust levers, the piston increases or decreases fuel flow to the A330's turbofan engines. However, during the flight, the valve was not responding to the commands because it was clogged with sap particles, preventing it from moving as required and disrupting the fuel flow to the engines. Fearing a loss of electrical power if both engines failed, the flight crew selected the auxiliary power unit to on and switched the engine start selector to ignition. The captain then moved the thrust levers again to test the engine responses. The N1 speed of the number 1 engine eventually increased to about 74% with the thrust lever in the climb detent position, while engine number 2 remained running below idle speed. ATC made both runways 07 left and 07 right available for landing. The flight crew carried out the all-engine flame-out, fuel remaining checklist from the quick reference handbook for engine number 2 in an attempt to clear the thrust control fault. The ram air turbine was manually deployed, the APU bleed was selected to on, and the number 2 engine master switch was set to off and then on. However, engine number 2 remained at a sub-idle speed. The crew then set the flaps to 1 and attempted to decrease the speed for landing by reducing the thrust on engine number 1. However, there was no corresponding decrease in its speed. The engine continued running as if the thrust was still set for climbing, but it wasn't. They were now flying way too fast for a normal landing, creating a very dangerous situation. The captain then publicly announced to the passengers that there was a small problem with the engines and requested that they remain seated and follow directions from the cabin crew. High drag devices such as speed brakes and landing gear were deployed. However, due to the high thrust from engine number 1, it was clear that they would be landing at high speed. Fully aware of the critical situation, the captain visually maneuvered the aircraft to achieve a touchdown as close as possible to the start of the runway. Due to the high workload and limited time, the crew didn't inform ATC about the abnormally high-speed approach. The aircraft was flown in a zigzag pattern to gain additional time to slow down. Despite these efforts, the speed remained high. Now, only a minute from touchdown, the overspeed warning sounded, indicating they were flying too fast. Hong Kong approach granted clearance for the flight to land on runway 07 left, informing them that the surface wind was from the southeast at 13 knots. Their speed was significantly higher than usual, so fast that the flight computer didn't recognize the landing attempt, triggering the ground proximity warning system.
Terrain ahead. Pull up!
As they descended through 900 feet, the crew stowed the speed brakes. Even though these were to prevent the speed from increasing further, they were too dangerous to leave extended any longer. Doing so would lead to the plane hitting the runway too hard on landing. The crew then selected flaps to 2, but a flashing F relief message was displayed on the engine warning display as the flaps were extended to an 8-degree position instead of the commanded 14-degree position. The runway was coming closer every second as they flew at an alarming speed. The pilots were fully concentrated, aware of the challenging landing ahead. The aircraft's systems beeped warnings, adding to the tense atmosphere in the cockpit. After a tense and stressful descent, they touched down on runway 07 left. Immediately after both main gears hit the runway, the right main gear bounced, causing the aircraft to briefly become airborne again. The plane then rolled left 7 degrees and pitched down again, during which the lower cowling of engine number 1 scraped the runway surface. Spoilers deployed automatically. Maximum manual braking was applied, and both engine thrust reversers were selected, but only the thrust reverser for engine number 1 deployed successfully. The aircraft came to a complete stop on the runway, just past taxiway A10, with its nose wheel about 309 meters from the end of the runway. The total distance for stopping the aircraft from the initial touchdown was approximately 2,600 meters. But it was not over yet. After the parking brake was set to on, the captain made an announcement requesting the passengers to remain seated while they evaluated the situation. Engine number 1 was still running at 79% thrust, despite being set to idle. The flight crew then shut down both engines by selecting the number 1 and number 2 engine master switches to off. The brake temperatures reached the top of the scale at 995 degrees Celsius on the cockpit display, prompting the flight crew to contact ATC and ask for any indication of a wheel fire. The tower controller said she had not seen any fire yet and suggested contacting the rescue leader. The rescue leader confirmed that the brakes on the left and right gears were hot and that he could see smoke and a small fire. The captain then ordered an emergency evacuation and shut down the APU by using the fire push button. All 8 emergency exit doors were used after the cabin crew had confirmed the absence of fire or smoke outside the exits. Some passengers took their cabin bags along and did not follow the crew's instructions to leave them behind before jumping onto the slides. The entire evacuation was completed in about 2 minutes and 15 seconds. The captain, the co-pilot, and the in-flight service manager walked through the cabin to ensure no one was left inside the aircraft before they exited. Fortunately, all passengers got off the plane safely and everyone survived. After the accident, an extensive investigation took place. It was found that the refueling facility at Juanda International Airport had recently undergone an overhaul, which involved replacing several underground fuel pipes. Heavy rain caused salt water to overflow from a nearby pond during this process and inevitably enter the system as the giant steel pipes were cut, measured, and resealed. The salt water had inadvertently entered the fuel supply and degraded the superabsorbent polymer filters, causing small sap particles to enter the Airbus's fuel system. These little particles caused the main metering valves of the fuel metering unit to seize, causing both engines to malfunction. The valves were stuck in positions corresponding to the recorded thrust output of each engine as it approached Hong Kong. Fortunately, everything turned out well thanks to the skilled actions of the pilots, who managed the situation effectively despite the difficulties. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave a like if you found this video informative.